rise above the static, dissecting issues diplomatic. With mics in hand, they brave the storm of clashing views and norms transform. The Pundits Podcast, bold and true, shining lights on red and blue. Through heated takes and reasoned thought, they seek the truth that can't be bought. From climate change to foreign ties, they pass the spinning and sift the lies. No stone unturned, no topic taboo, as left and right come into view. The Pundits Podcast, bold and true, shining lights on red and blue. Through heated takes and reasoned thought, they seek the truth that can't be bought. From climate change to foreign ties, they pass the spin and sift the lies. No stone unturned, no topic taboo, as left and right come into view. The Pundits Podcast, bold and true, shining lights on red and blue. Through heated takes and reasoned thought, they seek the truth that can't be bought. In times of strife when tensions flare, their steady voices fill the air. With wisdom gained from years gone by, and hopes for brighter days tonight, the Pundits Podcast marches on their epic quest, not yet done, to understand our changing world and keep democracy's flag unfurled.
Hey everybody, this is Razib Khan, and normally I say unsupervised learning, which I think a lot of you will have listened to the other podcast, but this is not unsupervised learning, this is Khanversation, and I'm here with my friend Josiah Neely of R Street. Some of you know Josiah because he's been a guest on the podcast, and I've been a guest on his previous podcast, Urbane Cowboys, and we're going to try to do something a little different here. A lot of you guys on my other podcast have said, oh, you should talk about politics and current events and other things more. And I don't do that. That's not the brand of unsupervised learning. But I've heard you, and I have done some market research and talked to some people, and there is a demand for this sort of like conversation, iterative, repeated. And so, I just want to see if you guys find this content interesting. If we can get a listenership here that's a little bit different. Josiah and I talk all the time anyway. So why don't we record it and clean it up a little bit, make it a little bit more structured. So I figured like this wouldn't be like that much of a lift for either of us. So and we're friends. And I think you guys will get that sense. So I'm not being overly familiar with him. He lives in Austin. I see him around. We're going to be releasing half of the podcast. There'll be an hour to an hour and a half. Half of it will be free, and we just cut it off in the middle. And we'll just be doing that indefinitely. It will be distributed on Apple and Spotify and all those things in a free version and YouTube. And then the paid version will stay on Substack. And so I think we're just going to keep it that way. It'll be simple and easy. I will have comments open on every episode. So if you have questions for us and suggestions for us, put them in the comments. And, we will take them under consideration the next week. We're going to be recording every Friday, every week, and it'll be released within about 12 hours or so of the recording. And like I said earlier, this is going to be less evergreen content than usual. So, those are the logistics. For those of you who don't know me, you came from somewhere else. Someone recommended us. I'm Razib Khan. I'm a geneticist. I advise a bunch of companies. You can see them on my X profile, RAZIBKHAN. And I also have a Substack, Unsupervised Learning, where I talk about genetics, history, and that sort of stuff. More, not newsy topics, but topics that are important in their own right. But it's a whole different thing than what we're going to be doing in here. Josiah, I think you should introduce yourself to the listeners.
Sure. And let me just say to begin with, because I told my wife that we were going to be doing this podcast, and she said, well, what's the name of the podcast? And I said, Khanversations, KHAN. and she didn't like that name. She said, "Well, why isn't your name in the podcast or whatever?" Right? Actually, I think I'm the one who came up with the name Conversations.
Yeah, you did, and it was the best of the ones that I saw.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'm cool. I think it's a good name. One, like my name doesn't have any sort of obvious punny content to it. Content. But then even beside that, I recognize, like I have some fans. I have some devoted fans out there. Hi, mom. But not on the same level as you do, Razib. There's no one.
We're,
People,
we're, we're gonna keep it real here, but this is a 50-50 thing,
yeah.
and so
Right. Yeah.
any revenues that are going to be made out of this are going to be split 50-50. This is one reason I wanted a separate domain. I really don't like. Well, I don't know. I'm not gonna say I don't like, but I don't know how all these Substacks that have all these contributors how they work. Okay, I don't know how you contribute, how you divide revenue. So like I've only had myself. I don't have guest posters. When I have people on for interviews, I give them comps to my Substack. So that's what I do. But I feel like this is gonna be like a 50-50 split. Yeah, I have more of a public profile, but we'll see. We'll see if there's some demand for the Neely out there.
Yeah, you're like, when we were talking about this, the shows of this nature that I like are things like Glenn Lowry, John McWhorter, or Robert Wright, Mickey Kaus, Megan Dom, Sarah Hayter, or whatnot. So I could be the John McWhorter to your Glenn Lowry, perhaps. I could be the Megan Dom, you'll be the Sarah Hayter. I don't know, but yeah.
Yeah, well, Sarah's a chatterer. She's the talker, and I mean Megan is like the straight man. Like if they were like a comedy duo,
Right.
like Sarah's like Jerry Lewis, and then who was the other guy? It wasn't Cary Grant. It was somebody else. But anyway,
It was Lewis and Martin, wasn't it? Dean Martin.
Dean Martin. Yeah. Dean Martin. So yeah. I mean, I think actually like I was a little like a little wary about having it be conversation, but I do think it is pretty good and catchy.
Yeah.
So I think we could just like go with it. Because like John and Glenn, it's called the Glenn Show, even though it's pretty much,
yeah.
it's like, well, I mean, a lot of it is just like, I think like John. I mean, he's not as enthusiastic about that stuff either.
Right. That's right.
I mean,
yeah.
Glenn does do all the lead work and keeps it going. So yeah, so we introduced ourselves. Actually, you didn't talk about R Street yet. Before talk about R Street. Like,
Yeah. And I should say, so my background, I was once an attorney. I work for like a free market based think tanks called the R Street Institute. Probably not. I mean, I'm not here representing R Street. Anything I say here, it's not a reflection on them. This is mostly because R Street, we deal with policy. I deal like electricity policy, that sort of stuff, energy. So I do that may come up some. I might have thoughts on it, but most of the stuff that we're going to be talking about is not going to be related to that. I don't think. But I do have my mature thoughts as a citizen or whatever.
Well, I'm just I'm just gonna say this because but you read a lot.
Yeah.
You have a lot of input, and you don't like really people don't know everything that you read and all that stuff. So I think we're gonna show a little bit of that erudition off a little bit. Also, I think we should keep open possibility that we could have a third guest, third person. Sometimes because just like
they do that on Red Scare,
they do have Red Scare, they do that on on a what is it, Special Place in Hell and the Glenn Show. So whatever. I mean, I'm not saying all the time, but and right now it's all audio. We will have visuals at some point. I need to probably like have like my bookshelf and all that stuff displaying, just so people know that I'm not stupid. But yeah, we're gonna transition to be a little bit more professional.
Take out the,
Yeah, you know what I'm saying. Yeah. No, but I don't care. I don't care. Like, people can come at me. I read whatever, man. I read it for the intellectual edification. Just because it's Madison Grant.
Right.
Those who know. Okay, so I think we do have some topics that we want to talk about that we want to hit. And so we did the introduction. Let's just start with the cultural stuff because you majored in film, I think, initially at UT. we talk about this every now and then, and I do believe this. Like 1999 was the greatest year in
Yeah.
the history of the world. Can you talk about why the '90s were great? Why the late '90s were great? Like, I mean, what is it? What is it for you? Like, I have my own opinions, but
Yeah, and I feel a little hesitant about this because they say that everybody thinks that the greatest time was when they were in their early 20s. You know, whenever you were 21, that's like the pinnacle of civilization in your mind because like you're young, the world's full of possibilities or whatever. But like in my case, it does seem like that's just literally true. The 90s, especially the later 90s, you know, the early 90s, you still had some issues like crime or like teen pregnancy or whatever. But by the late 90s, those were way on the down track. Soviet Union defeated, you know, America was kind of the uh, global superpower,
hyperpower.
hyperpower. Yeah. So we didn't have to worry about, you know, all that like Cold War era angst of, you know, are we going to get blown up by the Soviet Union or before that, the Nazis or whatever. That's all gone. Economy was, you know, rocking, was doing good. Culturally, people were kind of like laid back. I think a little bit. Music, movies. Probably my personal taste. I like the '80s a little bit better, but there's a lot of good stuff, you know, there in the '90s too. It was kind of a, I think they called it like you know, a vacation from history, something like that,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that's kind of how I view it.
Well, the movies. Like, let's talk about 1999 in particular. 1999 in particular, I feel was like a very special year.
Prince would agree.
And a lot of, there was like Pulp Fiction. Um, was it American Beauty? And
I think
there
it
was
was
like
earlier, but yeah, I mean that's in the '90s. Yeah,
yeah, like late '90s had all these great films, like Fight Club. So there's a lot of great films that were coming out in that period. So it was like after the 1970s like auteur phase, but still there was still some space for independent movies. Like they weren't like super weird, but they were kind of like a little offbeat. It was before the Marvel era. There was still independent culture. It wasn't dominated by sequels, but it was also more professionalized. We didn't have like Heaven's Gate or other sorts of just weird. I mean, so films from the '70s were dark.
yeah,
Films from the late '90s could be like dark comedy. So like Pulp Fiction, there's aspects of it that are pretty dark. There's a lot of killing in it, but it's also comedic. Because like the world that we lived in, it was a bright world. I mean, people don't. Younger millennials and Zoomers just do not understand that those of us who remember the 1980s. Well, I mean, I don't remember the '70s, but the 1980s, nuclear winter, all these things, and then they just disappeared. It was like a weight was lifted off our shoulders, and we had like nothing to worry about all of a sudden.
right. Yeah, even I think of like a big blockbuster summer movie like Independence Day, right? That's kind of there's an element of that kind of embodies the ethos where like
Yeah.
there's an alien invasion. Okay, the White House gets blown up or whatever, but it's still kind of optimistic in its orientation, and American can-do attitude. All that stuff, right?
Well, like today we would say like a lot of the lines, or like the president's speech, that we would say was cringe.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. You could appeal. You could appeal to like patriotism, all those sorts of things. Right. Yeah. You don't have to worry.
Well, no, I mean, basically, Gen X, and we're on the tail end of Gen X. But the whole idea of Gen X is that Gen X is cynical, doesn't care about anything. But that sort of toxicity, and let's just call it toxic, a little bit of toxicity is important. Like plants need toxins, you know what I'm saying, herbs and whatnot. But that sort of toxicity had not seeped into the whole culture. It was as a counter reaction or a counterpoint to kind of like that sort of earnestness and sincerity that maybe was a little bit more 1980s in that way. And so there was a synergy that I think existed in our culture, and that we saw broadly in politics, in geopolitics. Obviously, you could still be, America had not been destroyed by neoconservative hubris in the 1990s. And so we could still think that, oh, we were like bombing Sudan or Iraq or whatever, and it's because there's bad people there. We hadn't invaded a bunch of countries, and stuff like that. So it was just like, whatever. Like Russia is our friend, does things for us. Russians might have a different opinion of the 1990s, but we didn't know that. We don't care.
Right. Yeah. And another thing, and this was not true just of the 90s, but the 90s was kind of in the center of it, is I feel it was kind of uh, it was maybe a little bit of a peak in terms of race relations. If you go back earlier, obviously there's a lot of racial conflict. And then later, even though objectively a lot of things might be better, if you look at metrics, they're better or whatever, people feel just like really uh, bad and burnt out on like race stuff, and it seems like it's everywhere. And it was more, the '90s. It kind of receded a little bit. Um,
I think the key is recession, because I do want to point out the Rodney King riots and the OJ trial in the early to mid '90s. It wasn't necessarily a nadir. It was at the bottom, maybe in some ways, of white flight and crime and all those things. It was actually coming back already, but we didn't perceive it. By the late '90s, I think it was quite clear that that was like a bad past, and that we were going towards something different.
Yeah, yeah, and I kind of think, just from a like ideological or vibes based perspective, there were a lot of what I would consider kind of antisocial, maybe left wing ideas that kind of were discredited or had kind of faded out a little bit, where people didn't feel as hemmed in. So I do think a lot of for people like us of our generation, maybe even a little bit older, they just kind of want to get back to that, and politically, culturally.
Well, not everything was political in a way.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. Most stuff was
Like
not political. Yeah.
well, political polarization was there. 1994 happened, and so it was starting, and there was a lot of hatred towards the Clintons specifically, but it was towards the Clintons as individuals. Bill Clinton won Kentucky in 1996. He won Arkansas. Like, he won southern states. The regional polarization, ideological polarization was much mild. There were plenty of pro-life Democrats back then. Ramesh Panuru told me on my podcast that most of the staff that worked for George H.W. Bush in the 90s, early 90s, the 92 campaign, were pro-choice, So a lot of the polarization that we have today was not there. And so that meant the tribalization and the coalitional dynamics were just way more, dampened.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, I also think that, people's experience was different, right? So if you were, let's say you're like 30, 40 years old in the 90s, then in your adult life, what you've seen is, like thinking about, well, how do you view conservatism versus liberalism, or the Republican Party versus the Democratic Party, or whatever. I mean, you've seen like conservatives, okay, Reagan, we need to be tough against the Soviet Union. That's a win. Crime's out of control. They're tough on crime. Crime goes down. Taxes get cut. There's all sorts of like wins, and policies get enacted, and they seem to be successful, right? Seems like, whereas more liberal or left wing coded things, they seem to just not be working out very well, right? And even among people who are more left wing, a lot of them they're kind of defensive about it a little bit, right? They feel like, okay, we know these our ideas are not popular, and we kind of like have to.
Yeah. Well, so Karl Rove likes to say, he was saying, in like during, I think, the Romney Obama election or whatever, like, we're a center right nation, and I don't think that's necessarily. Look, I know what the polls say, but we both know there's been like massive changes. Like, civil unions for gays is the far right position in America now.
Right.
So I mean, all this stuff about center right nation, I don't know, but in the '90s we were.
Yes, and now if someone is in, let's say they're in their mid 30s or whatever, they're for their adult life, what is their experience of conservatism? It was like it's the Iraq War. It's I don't there was a big financial crisis. The economy has not been doing as great. Gay marriage, there's other cultural stuff. So it just is not. You don't have the same experience of, okay, these are ideas that are popular, they can win, and when they win, they work. Um, there's just a lot less of that, I would say.
Yeah. I think conservatism, you know, after George W. Bush, has been reactive. Also, like kind of atavistic is the term. Like 2012, Romney Ryan was like kind of like Reaganism on steroids, maybe with some anti-immigration aspects, but I mean, it just it didn't. I mean, it didn't sell. Even though it was coherent, but it didn't sell. Like just wasn't ready. America was beyond that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the world moves on, and things that make a lot of sense back in the '80s, it's a different situation now. You're dealing with different issues now. Some issues I feel like have kind of come back around again. Inflation. For most of my
Yeah.
life, inflation was something that you read about in history books or economic textbooks or whatever. It seemed like we had kind of managed it, and now that's a big issue. Crime, always kind of, it's never totally goes away as an issue, but it was a big, big issue. Like you can read, I think if you were to go back and read, what conservatives were saying about crime in the early '80s, it would make a lot of sense now, right? Whereas maybe some of the stuff about, like I don't know, tax policy, where I don't know. Yeah, but there's obviously a lot of new stuff as well that was not so much of an issue there. I don't think I don't like if you were to poll people in
Well, yeah. Well, let's just brass tacks. Like, what were we fixated on in the last third of the '90s? Bill Clinton's peccadillos, which
yes,
I'm not saying like it was great what he did and his behavior, but it was like one dude being a little pervy, you
right,
know, and that was the center of our culture. That was like what we were all obsessed with, and
yeah,
that just shows you how little there is going on, which is good.
right, right, yeah, and then the other thing is, when before the whole Monica Lewinsky stuff blew up or whatever, do you know, like Clinton, he was planning a big policy push. Do you know what his policy push was going to be? It got
No.
killed. It was Social Security privatization. He was going to create like a
Okay,
private
but yeah. Okay, yeah. So I mean, it
Democrat.
was like I had a friend whose dad was actually a Reagan Republican, but in the '90s he was voting for Clinton, and he was like pro-choice businessman. Okay, let's just
Right.
stereotype. And I asked my friend, I'm like, I mean, what is like? I mean, he's a Democrat. Like, why? And my friend was like, well, my dad just thinks of him kind of like a moderate Republican.
Yeah.
And like for the kind of stuff that he was interested in, like the business stuff, and also like probably like crime, it was fine. He didn't care about all the type of social issues that were concerning a lot of conservatives, nor was he a neocon. And so that kind of makes sense. So it was like a totally different political landscape. I also wonder about. I mean, I'm not like a big music person, but there was like alternative. There was like the decline of glam metal. I feel like '90s rock, Nirvana. This was before overproduction. I think
Yeah.
I don't want to sound like a liberal or a socialist about this, but like overproduction, over commercialization, and the neoliberal kind of takeover of culture. I think Marvel sequel films are the kind of like the end terminal state of it. But I think that's the thing with like bands that are produced, overproduced. They're not really authentic. We didn't. I mean, we had some authenticity. I mean, Kurt Cobain of Nirvana, he was so stressed out that he wasn't being seen as authentic. He killed himself.
Right. Well, yeah, there may have been other issues going on there, but it is true. And again, I don't. I'm always when I say this stuff in the back of my mind, I'm worried that this is you're just being an old guy. You don't understand the youth or whatever. But I do feel that if you listen to a song from before the year 2000, say, you can generally peg pretty closely when that song came out. It's like, okay, this is a 80s song, this is a 90s song, 70s. Sometimes you can peg it even like shorter than that. It's like this is early 90s, right? This is from that period before grunge and after, new
Glam.
wave, right? Yeah. Um, and now I think it's some of this, yeah, some of it is like the songs are all overproduced and there's auto tune or whatever, but the styles do not seem to have changed in over a decade. Where I can listen if I listen to a song on the radio and then I listen to something from 2011, who can say, yeah.
Whereas like okay, 1975 to 19, 87.
Right,
That's a
right,
huge difference.
yeah,
So yeah, or like 1965 to 1975. So one of the things that people talk about sometimes is that cultural change comes in bursts. So the distance between like 1985 to like 1970 is shorter in some ways than the distance between 1964 to 1970, right?
right,
In terms of like all of a sudden like the movies had nudity all of a sudden and all these things. These are discontinuous changes that happened over like 3 to 4 years. And then we're not, we don't remember the 60s because we were born after that, but people that are like younger boomers and older boomers, they all have told me the weird thing after the late 60s is how nothing ever changed. Now that's
right,
not totally true,
yeah,
but yeah, compared to what happened between 65 and 70, the rate of change since 1970 has been relatively slow, but I think we're seeing it progress even more uh, since we were kids. I feel like
right,
the hairstyles and stuff of the 80s versus 90s, it's like, okay, like there's some changes from the 2000s to like, the 20s, the
yeah.
aughts to the 20s, but they're not as extreme.
I do wonder. So one kind of theory I have about this is that in the past, let's say you were it's like 1974, right? Um, if you wanted to access culture from 1964, it would be pretty limited. Like you could get old records, I guess, but they're not playing that music on the radio. You can't you can't go online and look at old stuff. And now everything, like all of the past, is accessible to someone now in a way uh that would not even like
Yeah.
I have more access to what pop culture was like in 1974 than someone in 1994 would have to 1974, right? And so the time kind of goes away because you could just go on YouTube, you can go on Spotify, you can, everything kind of gets saved, right? And so I wonder if that has something to do with the timeless quality. Is that a big part of like these cultural changes
Sure.
is that the past was not accessible to you anymore, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. It's like the eternal present. One thing that I'm going to say here is, I did this podcast. I think December. I posted December of 2023 with my friend Cody Mosier, Dr. Cody Mosier, I think now. But anyway, he's a cultural evolution guy, and he has a lot of evidence from network theory and empirical research on scientific productivity that basically, if everyone is connected to everyone else, that actually slows things down in terms of innovation because I guess there's like too much conformity. People just average out.
Right.
Whereas like if you have like different like if you have groups that have periodic interconnections, but they're more isolated, they can kind of go their own way and innovate more. And so synthesizing that with what you're saying, I think one of the predictions of total access to, not total, but like, okay, operationally, we have like, we can find anything if we
Right.
want to look. on the so we have access to everything, and so that's an input into us now. And so in that sort of theory, there's too many interconnections for there to be kind of like the novel push into a different direction creatively. And I think that is also happening in film and other things where everything is over optimized and they also know too much
Yeah.
in terms of what works.
And it's probably going to get even worse now, with as markets become even more global, culture becomes even more global. I mean, I think one of the reasons why uh, the Marvel movies, other action sort of movies, are so big now is because like a comedy made for the United States, it's not necessarily going to translate to another like South America or China, right? Or Romania, wherever, Turkey.
Yeah.
Whereas action movies, okay, like they're not that dialogue heavy, right? People understand like big monster gets smashed by big robot. Um,
Yeah, well, I mean, so it's like the economics of it are you go for the lowest common denominator that'll appeal to the most people, and that's extremely well, it's relatively profitable. It's a big return. It's a rational thing to do. The problem is everyone does the exact same thing,
right.
and everyone starts to get bored. And so this is there's a game theory I think you call it coordination problem. If everyone does the exact same thing, then everyone's less happy. And so, we're getting into a situation where there's over optimization, hyper efficiency, and that actually leads us to being less happy. And, I don't know what the solution to that will be, but I think, going back to our original topic, I think the 1990s were good in some ways because we had the internet. So you started to have a
Yeah.
lot of interconnections, right? And probably, I don't know all the details, but I'm sure like film editing and all these other things. The first movies on digital were coming out in like the very end of the 90s, I believe. And so stuff started to get easier, but it was still not like overly optimized. And so you had like all these odd movies and these like unique musicians and stuff like that. It was leaning on the capital of the previous generation, and we've just kind of expended all that now. Now we're in 2024, and uh, if I go to Suno, which just so you guys know, I use that for the intro and the outre. If you like have a generic, if you like don't give it any instruction, it will sound like Taylor Swift. That's like the default of what
right.
music is. Taylor Swift. It's just telling you something. No hate on her, but
Yeah. Right.
that's the generic.
It's pretty good at doing generic stuff. So yeah, that's another issue is that as AI becomes more prevalent, that's also probably gonna, AI is very good at copying and creating generic versions of stuff. So we're gonna have a lot more generic, specification.
Yeah, I don't know how branding is going to be working, and that's a whole different thing. So we should we've been talking about this for a while. Let's move to the next topic. I want to talk about Austin, because you're local. I'm not a local. I moved to Austin in the spring of 2016. Yeah, when I tell people that, they're like, "Whoa, you've been here for a while." So I think the city has doubled. The city proper has doubled in population, in 40 years.
Metro
Uh, you know,
certainly.
yeah. And so, talk about, I don't know, like you remember the late 80s, you remember the 90s. Talk about Austin then to Austin now. I'm just curious because I don't know, obviously, the 20th century Austin.
Yeah, and in terms we were talking about movies earlier, I feel like the old Austin was best summed up by a Richard Linklater movie called Slacker. I would recommend it to anyone. It's not a traditional narrative. I think it's from like 1990, something like that. And the movie is a little weird in that you'll you'll have a scene and the characters are in the scene, and then at the end of the scene either uh one of the characters will leave and the camera will follow him. Sometimes someone just walks by in the background and the camera follows them. So no, there's no character who's in more than say, two scenes, right? And it just kind of jumps around the city throughout the day as people are doing different. They're not really doing a lot of stuff, actually. It's just a lot of.
They're just chilling.
They're just chilling, yeah. So that's what Austin was like. It was kind of a sleepy, hipstery kind of town. The university was there. State government was there, but it was not a big deal at that time. And it obviously was a lot smaller now.
Well, let me just jump in with the explicit populations because like I should have like looked. I should have the stage before I. So 1980 population is 346,000. 1990 466,000. Year 2000 657,000. 2010 790,000. 2020 962,000. Right now, the estimate, well, as of like the end of 2023, is 980,000 people. So
Yeah, so
these are like yeah, like over your lifetime, it's like a 3x. Obviously, some locals have left and some newcomers have arrived. This is not this is not due to reproduction.
well, yeah, some people are. I mean, I'm having kids.
Some people have kids, but like, come on, like that's like this is why this.
Cities are popular.
Okay. I have to say, because I've lived in. Okay, so people know this from the internet, so I can like I'm not doxing myself, but I lived in born in Bangladesh, lived in upstate New York for a little while, for like 6 years, lived in Western Pennsylvania for a year, Eastern Oregon for 5 years, and then went to college in Western Oregon for about 4 years, and I lived like in various parts of Oregon for a while. Then I lived in Berkeley for 4 years, Davis, California for 5 years, and then Austin now for 8 years. But I've like lived in places where there's like a lot of new people often that move there. And so in Austin, like most of us, like literally that's literally true. The majority of us are not from here. Okay.
Right.
And so that creates like a very, very different culture than in I don't know, like maybe Indiana. I'll just say Indianapolis. I don't want to say Gary or Detroit because those are extreme cases. But Indiana, like a city that's not like growing. And you've lived in Indiana, and and people have said, all this stuff online about move to a small town or like whatever. All these like these places that need people. But the problem is like those people don't have new people, and so they're very insular. Whereas obviously Austin, the Bay Area, New York City has new people all the time.
Right.
And so people are friendly to newcomers because everyone's a newcomer.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I mean obviously it's gonna vary somewhat. Austin, I think I mean it is still housing prices are reasonably affordable. I would say people here might not feel that way, but compared to, I mean, I guess it depends on what you're comparing it to, but compared to like, a tier one city, or like an elite capital city or whatnot, housing's pretty inexpensive. They let you build stuff here, and they let you can spread out. So that's good. And yeah, the general vibe of the place is dynamic, accepting, like new people. That's cool, right? People like it. People, of course, like bitch about traffic and all that sort of stuff. But in general, I think it's good, and I think that's a good place to be. You'd rather be people want to be as opposed to a place people want to get away from.
Well, I would say, I mean, yeah, there's average selection who remains, but I will say, I'm from the Pacific Northwest, and I can just tell you the hatred of people from California is so bone deep. I mean, it's pretty nasty, actually. I kind of took it for granted growing up that that's how people just behave and talk about, don't Californicate, keep Oregon beautiful, all these things.
Well, they
don't
say
Californicate it.
Yeah, I think actually,
yeah, they do. But it's not nearly as bad. It's way chiller.
Yeah, but I'll just say that I've you go to Oregon and people say, oh man, all the Californians, I don't, they're coming here and ruining the place. And you go to Arizona and they say, oh, the Californians ruining the place. Idaho, Texas, I'm sure if you go to Florida, they'll be like, those Californians, maybe it's, at some point you have to think, well, maybe the problem is you, not you specifically.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, the problem is like California's come in, like they sold their house in Carmel or something like that, and they're
Yeah,
inflating, blah blah blah. That it's usual thing. If California fixed its governance issues, I don't think that we would have these problems because fewer people would leave. Which
right,
to be honest, like that's one of the things with Austin. It is a blue city, but it's in a red state. The legislature overrules certain things, like when I first moved here, they banned Uber.
right,
Okay, the legislature overruled that the next year. Austin, it gets weird, but it doesn't get too weird.
right, right. Yeah,
Also, like rents have been dropping over the last 3 years. That's just like unbelievable. Like when I tell my friends in California or New York, yeah, rents have been dropping. They just look at me really confused. Like, wait, are you trying to say that they go like lower?
yeah,
they because for them staying flat is just like a miracle.
right.
They can't understand. And the reason rents get lower is because Austin builds a lot. They build a lot of housing, and like the skyline is quite different from when I moved here 8 years ago.
Yeah, yeah. I know people who got a rent decrease without even asking for it. It was just like, okay, here's a couple $100 a month. Just to make sure that you don't try and leave, go someplace else. Which, to a lot of people, I don't. In other places, I don't think they even realized that was possible. How is that? How could that happen? Yeah.
And as long as we keep building, as long as we keep building housing, that will also make it so that we're less hostile to new people coming here.
Right. Yeah. Well. Yeah. Yeah. Just. I mean, to some extent, there's always going to be tensions. I
I mean,
think.
there's natural hostility towards gentrification, quote unquote, right? That's the baseline. But there's real reason to be angry if your property taxes are going up and all these other, you know what I'm saying? And like schools, blah blah blah. But I think Austin has okay capacity. Like it could have more doctors, which is one reason they opened a medical school here. It was under capacity for doctors because they didn't have
Yeah.
the medical schools in Galveston for people who don't know. But overall, Texas has a philosophy of building. Now, the issue here, though, is like, people are like, oh, it's like free market libertarianism. Like, look, you actually talk to people, they're just like people in California. Everyone who buys
Yeah.
gets pissed that condominiums are going up and there's more housing because they want the free money. But this is one of those things where there's just like inertia with the previous philosophy of like it was a big empty state. Of course, they're going to allow you to build and develop, right?
Right.
And that's just like stayed in place so far. And I think as long as it's Republican governor, it will probably stay in place by inertia. But like if you talk to like Republican suburban people, they're just like people in California. It's just like
Right.
the starting position has mattered a lot in terms of how that policy works out.
Yes, and I do think what I've heard is that in California, like environmental regulations and whatever is a much bigger lever that people can use to take advantage of to stop development, which is not such an issue here. I would say.
Well, ironically,
Yeah.
you're an energy guy.
Yes.
We're kind of the clean energy capital of the country now because of the lack of environmental regulation.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Number one in wind. Number one, I think, in utility solar. Maybe not rooftop.
Yeah.
But
we've exploded. Like if you look at the numbers, Texas has exploded over the last 5 years, and it's mostly because like, I mean, obviously, like ideologically or just like I don't want to see ideologically. There's just like a dispositional thing where like Republican, conservative, red state people like fuck clean energy, But the reality is like you're allowed to build turbines here. You're allowed to build, and they just built it,
right. Yeah, you don't have to convince anybody at the state capitol or whatever. The system is set up so you can, if you can make money, then you can build it, and you end up saving people money too because it's cheaper electricity sometimes.
All right, so I got some stats from 2022.
Okay.
So we probably done better. Total renewable energy. It is 526 terawatts. And then after Texas, it's Florida, 259 terawatts. Then Pennsylvania, that's weird, probably hydro or something, 239 terawatts. And then California, 203 terawatts.
Yeah.
right? And California is a big state with a lot of hydro potential, a lot of sun, and also like there's a lot of like windy areas in the Central Valley. Like if you go to Palm Springs, there's turbines all around there, so they have a lot of potential. They're just not doing anything with it. They don't build.
Right. And they do. I mean, and obviously they have. I'm sure if you were to go to California, they have all sorts of targets and subsidies, for how much they want to do that stuff. But they are not able to compete with our competition, I guess you could say.
Well, I mean, it's just we're actually people in Texas are allowed to do what they say they're going to do in California.
Right.
So even if you don't want to do it, like, it's money. There's a lot of wind in the Rio Grande Valley, right?
Yeah. Right.
There's a lot of opportunities there. So you do it. Yeah. So I mean, Austin's obviously changed a lot. I will. I want to ask you because people have told me this, but you've been here long enough to know. Has the arts I know the live music thing was something that they kind of invented, I think, in the 1970s, but it became a big thing. And I've heard a lot of those people have left as people like, me have moved into town, people that work in tech and tech adjacent fields and whatnot. Have you yourself perceived that, or do you think it's a little overdone? I don't remember it, so I can't judge.
Well, I kind of feel, I don't think that many. So there are, I'm sure, some people who have moved out and other people who have moved in. But overall, I don't think it's. I don't think it's decreased. If you think about who were the people, who were like big in indie movies or other stuff like that, music. I feel like they're all still kind of here to the extent that they're anywhere, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So there are, you could, if you want to be like super avant-garde, you could go to Marfa or something like that.
Yeah, it's in our town. I want to correct myself. I read the wrong column. We are number one in renewables, but it's 139 terawatts. I read the total number, but we are still number one. Okay, we are still like considerably bigger than California, or better than California. Actually, Washington State. So in this list of renewables, Washington State is number 2, and that's all because of the bottlable power.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm from that area, so. Oregon is pretty high. Oregon's number 5 again because of hydro.
Yeah.
That makes sense, But we are number 1. I think mostly it's really wind that's really driven us.
Yeah, I mean, almost solar has been coming more just the last few years in terms of utility scale stuff, but wind has been big for the last 2 decades, really, just kind of ramping up and up and up.
By the way, the last state, the lowest state with renewable generator is Delaware. Just
oh man, Joe Biden, what are you doing? What are you doing to it?
Well, actually, like yeah, in the number percent, like the rank is like I'll do the last 10 because like they're kind of mixed actually. Well, DC is the lowest, but it's not a state. Delaware, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Hawaii, Mississippi, Alaska, New Jersey, Vermont, New Hampshire, and New Louisiana. That's all kind of like mixed,
Yeah, I mean, obviously you got a lot of small states there. I'm surprised that Hawaii is so low, actually, but maybe there's
a lot of the state is like off limits, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. So that probably has something to do with it. And Louisiana, maybe they just have so much oil there they don't feel like they need anything else. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, we have another topic, and I think like this is like we're around the area where there's gonna be a paywall, so so we're gonna be talking about politics. I'm just gonna ask you a question: is this the most important election in the history of the United States?
Yeah, I was thinking about that, and
hope you enjoyed the podcast so far. To listen to the rest of it, please go to Khanversation.substack.com.
Two minds met on a summer's eve, each with truths they long believed. Words flowed like a winding stream, as hours passed in deep debate. And after all was said and done, they found a thread of common ground. In listening close, they came to see a shared humanity. They spoke of justice, spoke of change, of history's weight and future's range. Their views at first seemed worlds apart, but patience bridged the divide. And after all was said and done, they found a thread of common ground. And listening close, they came to see a shared humanity. They spoke of justice, spoke of change, of history's weight and future's range. Their views at first seemed worlds apart, but patience bridged the divide. It's not about who's wrong or right, but understanding others' light. In civil discourse we can find ties that gently bind. And after all was said and done, they found a thread of common ground. And listening close, they came to see a shared humanity. As dawn broke soft on dewy grass, they smiled and shook hands at last. Two souls enriched by reason talk, united in respect. And after all was said and done, they found a thread of common ground. And listening close, they came to see a shared humanity. This folk song captures the essence of a long, thoughtful discussion between two public intellectuals. It emphasizes the power of patient listening, mutual respect, and the discovery of common ground. The gentle tone reflects the common understanding they reach after their debate. Would you like me to expand on any aspects of the lyrics or discuss the theme?